All right. Good morning, everybody. Glad you could be with us today. As Joe said, thank you for coming in the middle of this snow. This morning, when I got here around 7:30, 7:45, there was no snow on the ground. And look, here we are. It just came upon us. Level 1 snow emergency already. And here we are. All right. So my name is Caleb. I am one of the pastors here. If we haven't met yet, I'd love to meet you after service today, and I'll just be standing in the back. Last week, we talked about vision for the church, where we're prayerfully hoping that God would work through our church to reach others in our community and hopefully plant other churches. And if you weren't here last week, I would encourage you to watch the video of at least the last portion where Joe and I talk through the vision for our church over the next 5 years. And you can just see that on our YouTube channel if you want to catch up on that. I would encourage it. But this week, we are doing a new series, okay? We are going to be going through the first 6 chapters of Daniel. All right, first 6 chapters of Daniel. And I think Daniel is a helpful book for us in our context for a couple reasons. I think, first of all, Daniel talks about being in exile, okay? And being in exile means you're taken from your homeland and you have to go somewhere else. And in our context, we have many students. Okay, many of you are students, and you have left your home to go study something, right? Unless you didn't go here to play school, okay? That was for Josh McFerrin, and he's not here, but he'll appreciate that in the next service, okay? So we came here to study something specific, okay? And when you go to college, you feel like you have to form a new identity almost, or you feel like you've lost an aspect of your identity because you're out of your environment, right? You probably didn't grow up here in Athens if you came to school here, right? And you're in a different culture, you're in a different place, and you don't have a lot of your friends that you grew up with around you, right? And you might feel that a distance from home. You might feel like you are exiled in many ways, as your classmates may not believe many of the same things as you. They may have different values than you do. So you may feel like an exile as a student. But also, if you are not a student, you also may at times feel like an exile here in Athens. You may feel, even if you grew up here, that way at times because of what you believe, right? Your coworkers, your neighbors may not agree with what you believe about who Jesus is and what he's done for us and his call to follow him. And it might feel at times at work that it's hostile to you having spiritual conversations with your coworkers. I know when I worked for a bank for a few years, I was one of only a few Christians out of an office of about 80 to 90 people. And at times when I would try to have spiritual conversations with my coworkers, you could feel the kind of tension, right? They weren't excited about having those conversations. They thought it was weird, and it made me feel like an outsider to them, right? I couldn't relate to them on a certain level. And that may be how we feel. We may feel as if we are exiles here as Christians on this earth. So I think this will relate to a lot of us on some level as we work through Daniel. And so with that as context, let's go ahead and open up to Daniel chapter 1, and we'll be starting right in verse 1, right at the very beginning, and let's go ahead and take a look at what Daniel has to say. And here's what it says. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And we'll pause right there. Okay, these first 2 verses here really set up the whole context for the book, okay? And if you've ever watched a movie with a bunch of your friends and then that one friend comes in halfway through, they have all these questions, right? They're like, who's that person and who's that person? Why are they doing this, right? We've all had that friend come in halfway through and we're like, "Oh, why do you have to ruin it by asking all these questions?" Okay? Maybe that's just sin in my life, okay? But we've all had that friend, okay? And so I am here to set the context for us so we know what is happening and why it's happening. And so I have 4 key characters for us and 2 key nations as we work through this book. Okay? And our first key character here is Jehoiakim, okay? And he is the king of Judah, as our text says. He's a very important man, okay? It says they're measuring the years by his name, as is traditional with the king. So he's a big, important character. Although he may be an important character in general, he's not a good guy, okay? You don't want him as a friend in your life, okay? Jehoiakim is known, if you read Chronicles and Kings and Jeremiah, for defying God. He's known for promoting worship of idols, okay? Something explicitly that in the Old Testament they're told not to do. And so as he's promoting this worship of idols, God sends prophets to him to say, stop doing this, okay? That's very nice of God to give him specific messengers to say, don't do that, right? As if it shouldn't have been enough to have the parts of the Old Testament. But then when God sends these messengers, Jehoiakim doesn't listen to them, okay? He continues down the path of wickedness. And he even goes so far to kill one of these prophets that's sent to him. So not a great guy. Okay, his administration is known for corruption, taking bribes, all sorts of bad things. So Jehoiakim, not great. And he kind of characterizes the nation of God's people, Judah, for this period of time. He is meant to represent the moral state of God's people at this time. Wicked, corrupt, worshiping false gods. So that's character number 1. Character number 2, we have the other king mentioned, Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king of Babylon. And he is also known as Nebuchadnezzar II or the Great. Okay, if you have the name Great after you, you probably did some pretty cool things in your lifetime, right? And he is known for all sorts of military campaigns and victories. He defeated Assyria and Egypt, the 2 other major powers of the time. So he's a smart guy. He is a great leader. And he built all sorts of massive structures that some of which still survive today. You go to the Boston Museum of Art. You go to the British Museum of History in London. You can still see some of the things from his reign today. Okay, so he is an important guy, a strong leader. But what he really represents is what success in the world or in Babylon looks like. Okay, he has power, he has money, he has fame. He has everything from a worldly perspective we could want. And so that is Nebuchadnezzar. And the next 2 characters are not quite so obvious. All right. The next 2 characters, the first one is God, okay? Creator of the universe, nice guy. All right. God, okay? But sometimes when we read narratives in the Old Testament, we skip over God. We forget that he is acting in these narratives. He is doing things. So I want you, as we read through Daniel, look for what God is doing in the text, okay? And in Daniel, you'll see this a lot. God did this. God gave that. God allowed this, okay? You'll see that a lot, so look for that, all right? Then the other character we see in these first 2 verses is the God of Nebuchadnezzar, right? It says his God, meaning Nebuchadnezzar's God, twice, okay? And so this God is the foil to the one true God, or the opposition to the one true God. And the true conflict, or the major portion of the story that you are to focus on in Daniel, is not Daniel and his friends. Okay, that is a mistake we often make when reading Daniel. But it's not him and his friends we're supposed to focus on. It's a spiritual battle that is happening in the background. Okay, that is the reality of the conflict of Daniel. And so we have the one true God that we see, and then we have the false God, the God of Babylon. And this represents the wickedness of the nation of Babylon and the spiritual conflict that is happening, taking these vessels from the temple of Jerusalem to the temple of Nebuchadnezzar's God is an act of not only physical warfare, but spiritual warfare as well. And so this is the true conflict of Daniel. How will God's people fare, and what does that represent about who God is versus this false God of Babylon? That is the true conflict. So look for that as we read through Daniel. So those are our 4 people that we need to focus on and remember as we go throughout the story. And then we have 2 nations here. We have Judah and we have Babylon. Okay, and we'll start with Babylon. This is the superpower of the time. Okay, think of like how we tend to think of us as Americans, our nation. We tend to think of ourselves as better, as more militarily powerful than everyone else. I don't know if that's a word, but I said it. And so we tend to think of ourselves in that spot. And that's how Babylon thinks of themselves, right? They dominated the region, right? They won all these victories against Egypt, Assyria, and all these other places. And they were so wealthy at the time. And so that is the nation of Babylon. They are known for their wealth and they're known for their education. We have more documents surviving from Babylon than just about any other ancient civilization in the ancient Near East, okay? They have so many documents that are still existing today, and they're known for their learning and intelligence. So they're smart warriors, okay? Not somebody you want to go up against. That's who Babylonians are. And then transitioning to Judah, okay, we might have read portions of our Old Testament and say, I thought the people of God were Israel, right? Why are they not saying Israel, and why are they saying Judah, okay? And that's a great question. It's because there was long story short, there was a division theologically and politically in the people of God. They split into 2 kingdoms, and Judah is the southern kingdom that was faithful to God for a longer portion of time. But as we see with Jehoiakim, they have transitioned to a time of idolatry, generally speaking. And so these are God's people in the south. This is where Jerusalem and the temple are. So it's significant for that. It's also where King Solomon, or not King Solomon, it is King Solomon. King Solomon, King David, and Saul all come from Judah. Well, Saul from Benjamin, but that's part of Judah. So this is the region of the kings. This is the region of the temple. It's an important place that has now been taken over by a foreign ruler. And so thank you for bearing with me as we set the stage. Now we know the characters, we know the context, and we don't have to ask, who is this and why is this happening, okay? So now that we're on the same page, let's pick up in verse 3. Here's what Daniel 1:3 says. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, or Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, and Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king? Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food to be observed by you. And deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh, that's an interesting way to say it, than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. We'll pause there. All right, so essentially, what we have here is the Babylonians say, we're going to take the best of the best back with us, okay? They have some sort of like competition or some sort of selection process, like maybe like a Squid Game type of competition is how I picture it in my head. Maybe that's wrong of me to think that way, but that's how I like to picture it. And so they have some sort of way that they determine who is the best looking, who is the smartest, and who is the most skilled. And they say, we're going to take those guys back with us. And what we're going to do with this, we're basically going to re-educate them. We're going to say, you're going to learn our language, you're going to learn our religion, you're going to learn our laws, you're going to learn everything what it's like to be a Babylonian. And in addition to that, we're going to give you new names to help reshape this new identity. Okay, and so they're trying to inculcate them or get them enveloped in the culture of Babylon. Okay? And so they're reshaping these men with a purpose, though. They're not just arbitrarily doing this. They're saying, we're going to take these best of the best, at least from a worldly perspective, and we're going to take them and we're going to make them tools for our empire to help expand what we are doing. And so that's what is happening here. And one of the ways they would do this is by getting them to eat the Babylonian diet. So they're literally changing every aspect of what they do, right? They change the food they eat, the language they speak, what people call them, and what they read. So pretty much everything they're doing at this time has been changed, right? But Daniel and his friends here say, we're not going to go along with all of your program. Okay, we are not going to eat this food and we're not going to drink this wine. And in our context, we might say, well, why does that really matter? Why is that a big deal, right? Okay, if there's like some nice pork belly or bacon or something like that in this meal, why does it matter? Because that sounds pretty good, from my perspective at least. And so why do they care about this? Well, in the Old Testament, if you look at passages like Leviticus 11, there's all these dietary restrictions for the people of God, okay? The kosher laws. And they're to keep this because God tells them to, and because it represents God's holiness. So through what they eat, they are to represent how God is set apart and different from all the other false gods. And so this is a way that they would do it through what they ate. And so God is commanding this to them. So from Daniel and his friends' perspective, these Babylonian guys are asking them to sin. There's a moral quality to the decision that they have to make here. So if they don't follow the dietary laws, they are sinning, okay? And you might say, well, I eat bacon, and I like eating bacon. Okay, at least I do. And why don't we have to follow these type of laws? Well, if you look at passages like Acts 10, if you want to do further study, you will see that us as Christians no longer have to follow things like this dietary restriction as a result of what Jesus has done for us. Okay, so we are no longer held to it, and that's why we're unfamiliar with it as Christians. And so these four men, they say, no, we're not going to eat this. No, we're not going to drink this. This is what we would like to do. And they negotiate a plan with this chief administrator here, and they say, we won't do it. And it works out for these first 10 days. The guy says, no, your plan worked great. Keep on doing it. But let's fast forward 3 years to when they're presented to the king to see what happens at the end of the day. So picking up in verse 17, this fast forwards about 3 years in the life of Daniel and his friends. And it says, as for these four youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. And so this closes the first chapter of Daniel. And we see that God abundantly blessed these men. He gave them skills in learning. He gave Daniel the ability to interpret dreams. And what we see is that this is not necessarily a result of them working really hard and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. No, God gave them some sort of special ability in these areas. Certainly, they worked hard, right? They certainly studied, learned the language, and they worked heartily unto the Lord. But also we see that there is something special going on here, that God gave them special ability in this circumstance, that they are wiser, more knowledgeable than any of the elite advisors to the strongest nation in the area. And so we see there is a special gift from God here. And so as we're thinking about this first chapter in Daniel, it really is the prototype for the rest of the first six chapters of Daniel. And so I want to pull out three key themes that we see in this first chapter that you will see as we work through the other 5 chapters in Daniel. You will see these things come up over and over again. So 3 key themes as we work through Daniel. Number 1. God is in control, okay? God is in control. This is probably the number 1 key theme we see in all of the book of Daniel, even if you go past chapter 6. It is the key theme of Daniel. God is in control. And we see this weaved throughout the entire first chapter of Daniel. If you look at the first section we read in verse 2, it says God gave up Judah to Babylon. He gave them up to them. So the captivity that they were in, the exile or the taking away these people from Judah was not an accident. Okay, this is something that God allowed to happen, right? This is how God chose to punish his people of Judah. Okay, and so this is actually a sign of God's faithfulness to his promises for him to punish his people this way. It might not seem like that way at face value, but when you look at the Old Testament, you look at passages like Deuteronomy 29, you see that God said, if you go after other gods, I will do this to you. He promises to do it. This is the promised punishment for the Old Testament people of God. And so we see that God is in control in this exile, and we see it's actually a sign of his faithfulness to his promises. So we see it in verse 2. Then we also see in verse 9, we see God gave Daniel favor and compassion, right? He gave him good standing with this administrator that is over him. And it's not Daniel's wisdom, it's not his cunning that gets him this favor, okay? I'm sure he worked hard. I'm sure he was nice when he presented it to the guy, right? I'm sure all those things are true. But ultimately what Daniel says is it's not because of those things, but it's because of God blessing him and giving him favor that he is accepted and their plan is accepted, okay? So it's because God gave them favor. And then finally, in verse 17, God gave these men skill in learning and wisdom, right? These exceptional abilities, as we said earlier, were God-given, right? Again, they worked hard, but ultimately, God was in control, and he gave them a special ability in this situation. So we see weaved throughout chapter 1, God is in control all along, okay? So Daniel really focuses on this aspect of God is in control. Whatever you believe about how sovereignty and everything works, Daniel says God is in control at the end of the day. And I think this is an important corrective for our culture, because I think we like to think we are so much more in control than we really are. And I think it's because we have so many choices. It gives us this feeling of control, right? We want to go out to eat. There's a bunch of different restaurants that we can choose from, right? We are spoiled here in America with all these choices, right? You want to decide where you want to watch a movie on a streaming service. There's a bunch of different choices that you have, right? Whether you do Hulu, Netflix, HBO, whatever, right? There's so many different options. And these options give us this false sense of control in our lives. We are not nearly as much in control as we would like to think. And Daniel is a corrective to this, okay? God allows this suffering. He allows this exile in the life of his people to say, hey, I am in control here. You need to follow me. That is what is good for you. Okay? And ultimately, a lot of times God allows suffering and difficult times like this exile to teach us things like this, that he is in control and we need to lean on him. Okay? And I think of when I first moved to Wisconsin, and I know I've shared this story a couple times, but when I first moved there, my wife and I had things stolen from us just as we moved into our apartment, like a laptop. It took me longer to find a job than I had hoped when I first moved there. And then my wife also got diagnosed with a chronic illness, all within the first few months of moving there, right? And all those things ultimately taught me that I am not as in control of my life as I would like to think, right? I can't control other people's health. I can't control if someone's stolen something from me and just take it back if I don't know where they are at, right? I can't control so many things. I can't control if somebody hires me or not, right? I can submit as many applications as I want, but it doesn't matter if they don't accept it, right? And so ultimately what this showed me was God is in control throughout this whole process. I am not as good or as in control as I would like to think. And Daniel is a corrective for us in that regard. So he reminds us that God is in control. And second, we can take comfort in God during our exile. We can take comfort in God in our exile. And so Daniel is writing this book to people who are in a hard place. These people have been pushed out of their homeland. They have been forced to assimilate to a new culture. They've been ripped away from their friends and their family. And it's a hard place. They're faced with hard decisions. Will they conform to what these Babylonians are telling them to do? So it is a struggle for them. It is a hard time. And we as Christians are in our own form of exile. And here's what 1 Peter 2 says about this exile. It says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." And so 1 Peter is saying that as Christians, we are not at home. We are in a form of exile similar to Daniel. Peter is drawing on the imagery of the exile of Judah. He's drawing from these things. His audience knows what he's referring to with this type of exile. And so he's drawing from this imagery. And we as Christians are not at home. Right? This world is not our home, but heaven is our home. And so we are in exile from heaven for this period of time as long as we are on this earth. And so that's what he is saying. Heaven is our true home. And going back to my story when I first moved to Wisconsin, I obviously didn't feel at home. I had just moved there. All these hard things were happening to me. But it's not enough for me to simply theologically believe God is in control. That's not enough, right? Because if we just believe this intellectually in our head, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference with my attitude, with my heart, right? This needs to penetrate deeply into our heart and our soul. It's not enough to just think it. We have to actually believe it in our heart. And this isn't something that comes quickly, okay? It's not like you can just flip a switch in your life and say, now this intellectual thought has become deep embedded in my soul, okay? That's not the way life really works. Maybe it works for some people, but I think most people, this is a struggle and something that we have to work towards actively, okay? And so for me, what that looked like, it was going to God in prayer and consistently for weeks and wrestling with him in this difficult circumstance. It was meditating on Psalms regularly that expressed the pain and difficulty of what I was experiencing. Okay? And as I continued to pursue God in that, the Spirit did a work in me to give me peace in those hard circumstances. It wasn't anything that I did, but it was a gift that God gave me through pursuit of him. Okay? And I'm not saying that this is some sort of formula to make this happen in your life, okay? God may do it in many different ways. We can't put him in a box. He can do what he wants. All right? But I would say that this is a regular pattern that you see throughout the history of God's people. Pursuit of him in prayer and reading his word regularly and crying out to God ultimately does give us this type of peace if we do it consistently. Okay? That is a regular pattern. I'm not going to guarantee there's some sort of formula, but there's a regular pattern. And so Daniel is a reminder that because God is in control, we can take comfort in him, in our exile, in our suffering. When we feel like life just keeps kicking us in the teeth as we're down, we can go to him because he is in control. He can do things. He can change our hearts. He can change the circumstances if he wills, right? And so Daniel is a reminder to us that in our exile as Christians, we can lean on God and take comfort in him. And then finally, we should live according to God's design, even when it's countercultural. We should live according to God's design, even when it's countercultural. Okay? Daniel and his friends, they had all this pressure in the world, right? To just give in to what these Babylonians were asking, right? They could have easily said, yeah, I'll eat some of this food, I'll drink some of this wine. And it's not like it was bad food either, okay? This is the king's table. This is the best wine of the time. This is the best food made by the best chefs that existed in that period of history, okay? And so they're having to say no to the best food that probably existed on planet Earth during this time, and not to mention all the peer pressure of all the other people giving into it, okay? And so this is the context. They are asking they are asking to reject what everyone else around them is doing. Okay, and I think a secondary theme we see in Daniel is we are called to live counterculturally. And I think in our context, we often struggle with this because we think God is holding something back from us. We think this is something good and God is holding it back from me. Okay? I don't know if that's what Daniel and his friends were thinking, but I think in our context, that's our struggle, is we think this is something good God is holding back from me. Okay? And God wasn't holding Daniel and his friends back from good food arbitrarily. It was to represent his holiness. But in our culture, there are so many things that seem good at face value that are promoted by the culture around us, right? For us, maybe it's, why can't I sleep with my boyfriend or girlfriend, right? Because that is something that's not only okay in our culture, but is promoted, right? And why would God hold me back from this? Maybe for us, it's taking a shortcut at work, like your boss asks you to change a report at work that's not actually accurate to what happened, okay? And it's so easy to say, oh, well, actually, if I do make this change, I won't rock the boat, it won't cause drama at work, my boss will owe me one, and maybe I can move up the corporate ladder type of thing. And so maybe that's the struggle for you, that the call to grow and raise up the corporate ladder or be promoted at work is that temptation for you. And there's many things that tempt us that are approved around the world, right? Or in our world, right? There's so many things that are there to tempt us and look good at face value. And the fact is, I don't know exactly what this looks like for you in your life, but God does know what it is for you. And I think there's always going to be those things that entice us, that seek us to live, or try to get us to live the way of the world, help to get us to live the way of Babylon. But Daniel is a reminder to us that at the end of the day, following God is always worth it, right? We see with Daniel, they are abundantly blessed with all these skills. And on top of it, they are given wealth and power and position because of their faithfulness to God. And Daniel isn't saying there's going to be necessarily a one-to-one correlation that in this life, if you follow God, you're instantly going to have everything work out. You're going to get that promotion and get a bunch of money, right? That's not what Daniel is saying. But Daniel is saying that at the end of the day, if you are faithful to what God has called you to, even when it's countercultural, he will reward you. He will reward you whether it's in heaven when we go home or whether it's here on this earth. God will reward us for faithfulness to him. That's what he says. And so I'm not necessarily saying we're going to get everything we want on our timeline. We will get what God gives us on his timeline. But we are to wait and follow him as we await our heavenly home. But until we get there, let us remember that God is in control and we can lean on him in exile. And we need to live how he designed us to until we return to our heavenly home. So let's pray. God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for Daniel and his friends and how they lived faithfully even when it was difficult. God, I just pray that as we go out of here and we see those temptations, those things that entice us to live the way of the world, that we would stand firm, knowing that you are in control of the situation. Even if it seems like this is going to be something that causes more problems, that we would know that at the end of the day, following you is worth it. Right? And we may have to wait until we're at home in heaven with you, God, but I pray that we would look forward to that as we are tempted by these different things. We'd look forward to seeing you in heaven, and that you ultimately are the reward that we are waiting for. And so I just pray that also as we go out of here, that if we are going through something hard, that we would go to you in that. We would pursue you in prayer and reflecting on your word as we're struggling with different hard things and suffering when it feels like we are in our exile. But I pray again that we would ultimately look forward to you in the heavenly home you have waiting for us. So we just pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.